He owned everything a man could ever want: oil fields, palaces, private jets, the world's most famous football club. Yet Roman Abramovich was never truly seen. Behind the glass walls of luxury, he remained what he had always been: silent, watching, unknowable. He was the orphan who learned that survival meant invisibility. The businessman who rose not by speaking, but by never saying more than necessary. And the billionaire who built an empire so vast that even governments bowed to its gravity, yet still, when the lights dimmed, sat alone. On match nights at Stamford Bridge, he would appear in the owner's box, expressionless, almost ghost-like. Fans screamed his name. Cameras searched for a smile. But he never gave one. To them, he was the man who bought their dreams. To himself, perhaps, he was still the boy who had lost everything. He had mastered the art of quiet power, ruling without presence, influencing without words. But power, like wealth, has a price, and silence, once protective, can become a prison. How does a child who grew up with nothing end up commanding billions and yet remain haunted by the emptiness he started with? He could buy anything the world offered, but not peace. Roman Abramovich's story is not about greed or ambition. It's about a man who conquered the world only to realize that victory can be the loneliest place of all. He didn't chase fame, he bought silence. And in that silence, he built an empire and buried himself inside it. Long before the billion-dollar yachts and Premier League trophies, there was a boy standing alone in the frozen silence of Siberia. Roman Abramovich was born in 1966 in the industrial city of Saratov during one of the coldest decades in Soviet memory. His mother died when he was just a baby. His father, a construction worker, was killed in an accident soon after. By the age of 3, he had no one. He was passed between relatives like a quiet secret, raised in the bleak northern region of Komi, where winters swallowed everything in white and words meant little. He learned early that life didn't offer comfort, only endurance. Silence became his first language, survival his only faith. While other children dreamed, Roman observed. He watched how people worked, how they traded, how they hid their intentions. In a system built on fear and scarcity, he discovered the art of reading between lines, of listening without speaking. That skill, that instinct to adapt without revealing, would become his greatest weapon. In his teenage years, he worked small jobs: mechanic, laborer, soldier. He never excelled in school, but he excelled in patience. When the Soviet Union began to crack, millions panicked. Roman prepared. He saw what others didn't, that chaos creates opportunity. By his early 20s, he was selling plastic ducks on Moscow's gray streets. It was humble, almost absurd. But for him, it wasn't about the ducks. It was about learning the rhythm of trade, the psychology of people, the pulse of a market that was just waking up after decades of control. Each deal, each risk taught him how to move quietly within systems much louder than himself. He was building a mind for transition for the world that was coming. And when the Iron Curtain finally fell, Roman Abramovich was ready. He had no inheritance, no power, no safety net. What he had was something rarer: a survivor's clarity, the ability to see through illusion. He understood that in the new Russia, money would replace ideology, and silence would once again be the safest armor. He wasn't driven by greed. He was driven by escape from the poverty, from the instability, from the memory of being powerless. The boy who had lost everything was determined to never lose control again. In the late 1980s, as Moscow opened its markets, he began small trading commodities, fuel, and whatever could be moved fast and sold faster. It was not glamorous, but it was survival upgraded to strategy. His calm demeanor, his discretion, his refusal to boast, these made him invisible in the best possible way. While others shouted, he listened. While others flaunted, he adapted. He didn't want attention. He wanted access. And in a country devouring itself, Roman Abramovich was quietly learning how to rebuild not nations, not industries, but destiny itself. He had been hardened by loss, sharpened by silence, and forged in the cold. Everything? He would become the businessman, the oligarch. The ghost of power began here in the frozen stillness of a boy who understood that in a world built on noise, those who survive are the ones who learn to move without sound. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the ground beneath 300 million people disappeared. For some, it was chaos. For Roman Abramovich, it was clarity. He saw not the end of an empire but the beginning of a marketplace. In the early 1990s, Moscow was a storm of desperation. Rubles were worthless factories, abandoned laws rewritten overnight. Where others saw ruins, Abramovich saw a blank page. He started small, trading oil, rubber, even toys. His instincts were almost surgical. Find what people need, find who controls it, connect the two quietly. His office was a suitcase, his network, his silence. But the real opportunity came with privatization, the wild historic sell-off of Soviet industries to private hands. Overnight, the wealth of an empire went on sale. Those with connections, nerve, and luck could become kings. Abramovich was not loud, not ruthless, not charismatic, but he had something rarer, the ability to read people and disappear into trust. That gift led him to Boris Berezovsky, one of Russia's first oligarchs, a man who ruled through influence and chaos. Berezovsky saw in Abramovich a useful partner, discreet, loyal, efficient. Together, they acquired Sibneft, a massive oil company, for a fraction of its true worth. It was one of the most profitable deals of the century, and it turned Abramovich almost overnight into a billionaire. But unlike Berezovsky, who craved power and attention, Abramovich stayed quiet. He didn't give interviews, didn't flaunt wealth, didn't join the political games, he watched them. In a country where ambition could be fatal, he learned that invisibility was the ultimate privilege. He built relationships not through force, but through consistency. His greatest talent was making powerful men comfortable, making them feel he was useful, not dangerous. He wasn't the loudest in the room. He was the one who listened when everyone else was shouting. When other oligarchs threw parties, he studied systems, supply chains, logistics, exports. He didn't just buy companies, he learned to make them run. Underneath the quiet surface was a mind obsessed with order, efficiency, and control. He once said privately, "Power is temporary, structure lasts." By the mid-1990s, Abramovich had built a web of businesses across oil, aluminum, and trade. But more importantly, he had built relationships in the Kremlin, relationships that would determine who survived in the new Russia. He was not the richest, not the most connected, but he was the least threatening. In a world of predators that made him untouchable, he understood that money without protection meant nothing. So he built both patiently, invisibly. When the dust of the 1990s settled, dozens of oligarchs had risen and fallen, but Abramovich remained. Because while they sought power, he sought permission. While they played politics, he played patience. He didn't conquer the system. He learned how to move inside it quietly, precisely, like a ghost. And by the time the world noticed his name, it was already too late. Roman Abramovich had become one of the most powerful men in Russia, not by shouting over the noise, but by mastering the silence beneath it. At the dawn of the new millennium, Russia was changing again. The wild 1990s were ending the chaos, giving way to a colder kind of order, one ruled not by fortune, but by fear. When Vladimir Putin rose to power, the age of loud oligarchs was over. The new rule was simple: stay loyal, stay quiet, or disappear. Roman Abramovich understood that immediately. He had no desire to be a martyr of wealth. He wanted to endure. While others tried to influence politics, Abramovich adapted to it. He met the new power with humility, not defiance. He offered cooperation instead of confrontation. And in return, he received what he valued most: permission to exist. Unlike other magnates who flaunted their wealth, he moved softly through Moscow's corridors of power. He kept his profile low. His words measured, his loyalty visible. Where others demanded attention, Abramovich made himself indispensable. That quiet instinct to serve, not to challenge, became his survival code. In 2000, he did something no one expected. He entered politics not to gain influence, but to give it away. He ran for governor of Chukotka, one of Russia's most remote and impoverished regions, a frozen corner of the Arctic where few even knew his name. He won easily, but instead of using the position for power, he used his fortune for purpose. He poured hundreds of millions of his own money into schools, hospitals, housing, and infrastructure. He built airports where there had been ice, libraries where there had been silence. Children who had never seen running water suddenly had classrooms with computers. To a nation drowning in cynicism, it was an act that felt almost spiritual. He didn't speak about charity, he practiced it. To some, it was strategy, a way to prove loyalty to the Kremlin, a shield of goodwill. But to those who knew him, it was also something deeper. Abramovich understood poverty. He had lived it. He remembered what it felt like to have nothing to be forgotten. In Chukotka, he saw a chance to build something clean, a legacy untouched by the oil and politics that defined him elsewhere. While other oligarchs were fighting for survival, he was rewriting his image. The silent trader had become a quiet benefactor, the ruthless deal-maker, a reluctant humanitarian. By the mid-2000s, Abramovich's wealth had exploded. Sibneft grew into one of Russia's most valuable oil companies before being sold to Gazprom for over $13 billion. His assets stretched from metals to real estate. His name whispered in every boardroom. Yet through it all, he remained elusive. No social media, no memoirs, no interviews. Just the same expression, unreadable, distant, composed. He didn't crave recognition. He craved control. He had survived 3 political regimes, 2 economic collapses, and a system that devoured the careless. His secret was simple: adapt without changing yourself. He didn't rule Russia's new empire of wealth. He navigated it like fog, silently, carefully, unseen. Roman Abramovich had become what every oligarch wanted to be: a man too useful to destroy, too silent to fear, and too powerful to name. In 2003, Roman Abramovich made a move that no one in London or Moscow saw coming. He bought Chelsea Football Club. To the West, it seemed like just another billionaire's indulgence, another plaything for power. But for Abramovich, it was something else entirely. It was escape from politics, from suspicion, from the cold machinery of Russian capitalism. For the first time in his life, he was not buying control. He was buying joy. Chelsea was struggling then, deep in debt, chasing dreams bigger than its wallet. Abramovich paid £140 million and erased the debt overnight. Overnight, London had a new king. But he didn't step into the limelight. He watched from the shadows of his glass box, almost shy. When reporters shouted his name, he nodded once and disappeared. Yet beneath that quiet exterior was revolution. Within months, Chelsea transformed. He spent hundreds of millions to build a team that could compete with anyone, not for profit, not even for prestige, but for perfection. He demanded excellence without spectacle, results without noise. He didn't talk tactics or glory, he talked systems, discipline, trust, and the results spoke for him. Chelsea lifted 5 Premier League titles, 2 Champions League trophies, and countless cups under his ownership. In a sport ruled by ego, chaos, Abramovich became the silent architect of dominance. He didn't celebrate with champagne or press conferences. He celebrated with stillness, a single nod from the stands, a faint smile, then nothing. He had turned football, that most emotional of games, into a reflection of himself, precise, efficient, unflinching. To fans, he was a savior. To critics, a symbol of money corrupting passion. To him, Chelsea was neither business nor propaganda. It was belonging. For a man who had grown up without family, without home, Stamford Bridge became the only place that ever felt like one. Players came and went. Managers rose and fell. But Abramovich remained the constant, the quiet force at the center of it all. Every decision, every investment, every change came with the same philosophy that had built his fortune: adapt, improve, and never explain. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was chasing balance between loyalty and ambition, between art and discipline, between the chaos of life and the control of creation. And yet, even in triumph, he never looked comfortable in the light. After every victory, he retreated quickly back to the corridors, the tunnels, the solitude. The applause was for others. The silence was his reward. To the outside world, Abramovich had conquered 2 empires, one of oil, one of sport. But inside, he was still that same boy from Komi, always watching, always building, never resting. He didn't buy Chelsea to own a team. He bought it to build a world he could finally trust. A place where loyalty had rules, success had structure, and emotion, for once, felt safe. In a life defined by power and survival, football was the one arena where Roman Abramovich could be something else entirely. Not an oligarch, not an exile, just a man who wanted to win quietly. For nearly 2 decades, Roman Abramovich's Blue Empire stood as his masterpiece, a sanctuary built of loyalty, precision, and control. But empires, like seasons, always change. In 2022, when the world fractured again over war, even silence could not protect him. The same restraint that had preserved him through every storm now became his undoing. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the West turned its gaze toward the men behind the money. Sanctions fell like dominoes, swift and unforgiving. And though Abramovich had long distanced himself from politics, his name was still written in the language of power. His assets in the UK were frozen. His homes, his jets, his accounts all locked away. Even his greatest creation, Chelsea, stood on the edge of collapse. The government demanded his resignation. The fans wept confused, angry, divided. Abramovich, true to form, said nothing. No defenses, no declarations. Only a brief statement he would sell the club, and every penny of the proceeds would go to victims of war. In a world built on ego, it was an act of quiet surrender, not weakness, dignity. The sale of Chelsea marked the end of an era not just for football, but for the man himself. For 19 years, Stamford Bridge had been his stage, his proof that wealth could build beauty, that control could coexist with grace. Now, he watched it all fade, from afar a spectator to his own disappearance. He left London as silently as he had entered it, no farewell, no entourage, no words. A ghost departing the empire he had once animated. Those who knew him said he was neither bitter nor broken, just still. He retreated from public life, dividing his time between Israel, Turkey, and the open sea, aboard a yacht that felt less like luxury and more like exile. The world that once whispered his name now debated his morality, his motives, his silence. But Abramovich never joined the conversation. He never had. He had lived long enough to understand that power can buy comfort but not immunity. Influence can protect you from enemies, but not from history. And so when the world demanded noise, he chose absence. He gave up the game, but not his grace. Because for Roman Abramovich, survival was never about winning battles, it was about knowing when to leave the field. He had entered the world through chaos, built his fortune through silence, and now he would fade through the same quiet, leaving behind not an apology, but an echo. An empire dissolved, a man unbroken. And in that stillness, perhaps for the first time, Roman Abramovich was finally free, not powerful, not feared, just free. When the noise of politics faded and the lights of football dimmed, Roman Abramovich remained not as a mogul or a villain, but as a mystery. A man who had once commanded oil fields, boardrooms, and stadiums now lived between borders without a country that claimed him, or a world that truly understood him. He was too Russian for the West, too Western for Russia, too powerful for friendship, too private for fame. Yet behind the walls of silence, his legacy endured complex, contradictory, and deeply human. He was one of the few men who rose from the wreckage of an empire and learned to navigate the void it left behind. His story was not about greed, it was about endurance, the quiet art of survival in systems that devoured their creators. From Siberia's frozen streets to London's royal circles, he had mastered the balance between visibility and invisibility, between influence and disappearance. But that mastery came at a price: the loneliness of power, the suspicion of loyalty, the impossibility of trust. For every empire he built a wall around himself. For every victory, a layer of silence. Even in triumph, he looked apart as though the act of winning demanded distance. In the end, his truest empire was not Sibneft or Chelsea, but the discipline of restraint, a lifetime spent proving that silence can be stronger than speech. He had bought art yachts, islands, and teams. He had met presidents, kings, and captains. And yet, those who knew him best said that he never truly enjoyed any of it. His satisfaction came from control, from knowing that everything for a moment ran exactly as he intended. But control, like power, is an illusion that time erodes. As he withdrew from public life, Abramovich turned increasingly toward philanthropy, education culture, humanitarian relief. Much of it done quietly, anonymously. Even his final act with Chelsea, donating billions to victims of war, was consistent with the man he had always been: generous, without confession, powerful, without presence. He never explained himself. He didn't need to. His life was the explanation. He was the child who lost everything and the man who refused to lose control again. The immigrant who turned oil into empires and loneliness into language. The symbol of a generation that traded ideology for influence and paid for it with solitude. Roman Abramovich didn't die a hero or a villain. He lived as a paradox, The proof that in the modern world, silence itself can be a form of power. He had conquered fortune, fame, and football, but never himself. And so his legacy lingers not in trophies or skyscrapers, but in a single truth whispered through the decades. You can buy almost everything. Except peace? Roman Abramovich didn't just build wealth, he built quiet, and in that quiet found both his empire and his exile.